If you followed any of our festivals from before, you'll know that they were devoted to individual composers. There was Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Brahms, and Mozart. And then we ran out of composers where you could comfortably fit in a 3-week festival with a complete group of things. A Haydn festival couldn't play all 104 symphonies in 3 weeks, so forth and so on. So I decided to do a French festival, not comprehensive, but just little samplers, little ideas of what the French music culture is, because it spans this gap in music history. We think about the Viennese and the Germans, and to some degree the Russians, but the French composers you had existed in the Baroque time, Rameau, Couperin, Lully, and then it takes a long time for French music to come back into the fold as part of a repertoire, perhaps beginning with Hector Berlioz. So why was that? Why did French music seem to follow a different path than any other country was taking? And over the course of the 3 weeks, I suspect we're going to learn a lot, and how we'll see all the other arts and the cultures reacting to the music, and in many ways being progressive, in some ways being American with jazz before we were doing it in the concert hall. And we are so happy to have for our guide through this festival a man whose major in school was not French but German, but who is leading authority on one of the most bizarre and interesting characters in all of music, Erik Satie, who we'll hear next week. So it's my pleasure for you to meet Stephen Whiting.
Thank you so kindly. Mesdames, Messieurs, bonsoir et soyez les bienvenus au Festival français de l'Orchestre symphonique de Détroit. Yes, I worked all day on that. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the French Festival of the DSO. On the eve of her first trip to Paris, my then 9-year-old daughter declared that she had figured out how she would pass for a French person, even without growing a mustache. Dad, I'm going to wear a beret and a black turtleneck, and I'll carry a baguette under my arm. Here I am without my baguette. I am Stephen Whiting, one of 2 musicologists who specialize in French music at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. The other specialist, Jane Fulcher, is enjoying her sabbatical leave in Paris this semester. I want not only to introduce you to the music of tonight's concert, devoted to Maurice Ravel, but also to provide some cultural context for the whole month of music before us. My own doctoral advisor, always willing to be provocative, used to say that war was the only way some cultures could communicate with each other. Exhibit A in this mini lecture was always Germany and France. During the nearly 200 years spanned by the DSO's French Festival, that is from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique of 1830 to Guillaume Connaissant's Flammenschrift, and note the language of that title, France had the dubious distinction of engaging in 3 disastrous wars with Germany. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71, and of course World War I and World War II. The first and third of these martial encounters involved actual occupation of Paris by German armies. The second, mere bombardment. Those who take a longer view might observe that Germany was finally doing for itself what Louis XIV had done for France in the 17th century, changing from a far-flung linguistic territory into a single centralized state, defining itself along the way by picking wars with its neighbors. This is how the Holy Roman Empire, which of course was German, had lost the territories of Alsace and Lorraine to France in the first place, back in the 1680s. And of course, those two territories were hotly contested thereafter. Remember, too, that not 20 years before the premiere of Berlioz's ever so fantastic symphony, pretty much all of German-speaking Europe had been conquered by Napoleon Bonaparte. The lands Napoleon had overrun pretty much took over the Parisian musical scene in the further course of the 19th century. Opera in Paris was dominated by Italians, from Rossini through Verdi. Orchestral concerts, such as they were dominated by Beethoven, whose symphonies, paradoxically enough, the French had learned to play before the Germans did. French composers had a tough time of it in their own country. The War of 1870 was an efficient demonstration of Prussian military superiority. It lasted barely 10 months and ended in the capture of the monarch Napoleon III. It forced France to abandon monarchism and Bonapartism all at once. The time was ripe for changes of all sorts, and French composers seized the opportunity to organize themselves into a Société Nationale de Musique, a national society of music. One of the founders was Camille Saint-Saëns, probably the most famous French composer of the day. We'll be hearing from Saint-Saëns this coming weekend. Do come back Saturday or Sunday. In promoting serious music by French-speaking composers, the Société Nationale was saying, in effect, look, Italian opera isn't the only show in town, and Germans aren't the only ones who know how to write instrumental music. Most every French or Francophone composer who came to prominence after 1871 benefited from the Society's support. Just counting composers offered during our French festival, that would be Debussy, Dukas, Satie, and Ravel. There was only one problem: Richard Wagner. Wagner was not unknown in Paris, of course, but in the 1880s, Wagner's music dramas and Wagner's philosophical baggage became enormously popular there. Every major French composer of the late 19th century made the pilgrimage to Bayreuth to see The Ring and Parsifal produced at the Festival Theater. Why go to Bayreuth? Because Wagner had forbidden performance of these works anywhere else. But excerpts on symphony programs were fair game. Didn't the DSO just do its own Ring Without Words a few weeks ago? In Paris, Charles Lamoureux and his orchestra, and here I'm quoting an English observer, Charles Lamoureux conducted Wagner's operas every Sunday during the summer like a priest conducting Mass. Even within the Société Nationale, pressure grew to promote performance of foreign music, and Camille Saint-Saëns quit the society when the Wagnerian camp grew too strong. One theme of my pre-concert lectures, put somewhat tendentiously, is paths around the German juggernaut. The music of tonight's concert shows us three: the path through the past, the path via Russian culture, especially Russian ballet, and the path via the US. I'll consider the pieces in chronological order, not in the order of their performance tonight. The Menuet Antique of 1895 and the Pavane of 1899 manifest the path through the past. Both stem from the very beginning of Ravel's creative career, and both started life as solo piano pieces. Ravel was trying here for what one scholar has called the non-historical recreation of a past style. The minuet, for example, originated as a French country dance in the mid-17th century, but that didn't mean Ravel needed to compose in a mid-17th century style. The structure and the phrasing of the dance are traditional, but the harmony is very much Ravel's and quite daring for the 1890s. The Minuet Antique was the first composition of Ravel's to appear in print. And when Ravel toured the United States as a composer-pianist in 1928, this was one of the pieces that he played. That tour, by the way, included a visit to the Ford factory in Detroit, which Ravel found as splendid as Fritz Lang's film Metropolis, or so he wrote in a postcard to his brother back home. Ravel wrote the Pavane pour une infante défunte in late 1899. The title in English translation, Pavane for a defunct infanta, sounds unmusical by comparison. It always irritated him when people asked Ravel which princess he had in mind. He claimed to have devised the title for its musical qualities alone. What irritated him even more was the enduring success of the piece. It became for him what the prelude in C-sharp minor became for Rachmaninoff. What irritated him most of all were performances that were too slow. It is the princess who is dead, not the Pavane, he is supposed to have said. The piano version had its first public performance at a concert of the Société Nationale in 1902. Perhaps due to the popularity of the piece, Ravel orchestrated it in 1909. The Minuet Antique he orchestrated only in 1929. Fast forward a decade, and a significant Russian has entered the picture. Sergei or Serge Diaghilev. Diaghilev was one of those amazing figures like Peter Gelb, whose talent it is to get others to work productively together and to find enough wealthy patrons to pay for it all. This is what an impresario does. In 1906, Diaghilev took a traveling exhibition of Russian painting to Paris, and in 1907 he started bringing the latest Russian music. Alert composers like Claude Debussy were already aware of this music. Debussy, after all, had served a couple summers as house pianist for Tchaikovsky's great patron, Nadezhda von Meck. So he'd actually spent time in Russia. But the Parisian public were bowled over by this latest music, music that wasn't necessarily Tchaikovsky. They'd never heard it before. The next year, Diaghilev mounted a production of Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov. And the year after that, 1909, he added ballet to the mix, calling his newly formed troupe simply the Ballet Russe, the Russian ballet. And he started commissioning scores from just about every composer of consequence, among them Stravinsky, Debussy, and Ravel, eventually even Erik Satie. It took Ravel several years to deliver his score for Daphnis and Chloe, because, among other reasons, he had decided that the Société had become too stodgy, and he was forming his own independent musical society. As in academic department meetings, so too in Parisian musical politics. There is no hair so fine that it cannot be split further. This is just something that always happens in Paris. So the premiere of this ballet took place only in June 1912. The scenario was based on a novel by the ancient Greek author Longus, who lived during the 2nd century AD. Did I mention the path through the past? Daphnis and Chloe are your typical ancient Greek boy and girl who have been abandoned by their parents in infancy to die of exposure, and who are each discovered and raised by shepherds on the island of Lesbos. They grow up herding flocks for their foster parents, and inevitably, they fall in love. There are complications, of course, just as in the musical Oklahoma. There's a rival cowherd. There are pirates who abduct Chloe, which requires the intervention of the god Pan. I know that's not in Oklahoma. But it all works out in the end. That is in Oklahoma. Ravel wrote about an hour's worth of music for this ballet. The ballet is rarely staged today. Thank goodness, he also drew 2 concert suites from this music. The second suite, heard this evening, begins with the most magical sunrise ever depicted in music. You hear at the beginning rivulets of dew cascading from the rocks. You hear each bird awaken. You hear the burst of light. You hear shepherds piping in the distance. And finally, since this is part 3 of the ballet, after many a vicissitude, you hear Daphnis and Chloe reunited, throwing themselves into each other's arms. Da, 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 da. It's a pretty lush part, much lusher than I just sang. Together, they reenact the romance of Pan and Syrinx. That's the pantomime. One highlight of this central section is an extended flute solo that takes me straight back to grad school. I heard it being practiced from an excerpt book every night I stayed late working in my tiny office. With such musical persuasion as this flute solo, they must fall once again into each other's arms. They swear their fidelity before the altar of the nymphs in a solemn musical moment. And then comes the most riotous general dance, much of it in 5/4 time. A bacchanal to make Philadelphia after the Super Bowl seem tame. So Ravel has found paths through the past and via Russian culture that bring him around the German juggernaut. Another path was American jazz, which he knew firsthand from his concert tour through the US, quite apart from the popularity of jazz and jazz musicians in Paris right after World War I. You're going to hear a thick streak of jazz in each of the piano concertos. Ravel started the G major piano concerto shortly after his American tour, which explains, I think, the Gershwin-esque clarinet solo in the first movement. It's like Rhapsody in Blue with a baguette under its arm. But then, during a quick trip to Vienna, Ravel received a commission from an Austrian pianist who had lost his right arm in World War I. Paul Wittgenstein, yes, the elder brother of the philosopher Ludwig, commissioned works for piano left hand from Richard Strauss, from Prokofiev, from Hindemith, even from Benjamin Britten. But the most famous work he commissioned was the concerto from Ravel. From that point, Ravel worked feverishly at 2 concertos simultaneously, finishing the left-hand concerto in September 1930 and the G major concerto in July 1931. He was racing not only against deadlines, but against his own declining health. The works received their respective premieres in Vienna and Paris, 8 days apart in January 1932. Ravel dreamed of taking the G major on a tour of 5 continents, but he had to settle for a European tour, which exhausted him still further. The concerto for the left hand comprises a lengthy slow introduction, a slow movement, and a scherzo, but all fused together, so you don't have to worry about clapping between movements. Toward the end, there is an astonishing cadenza for the soloist, a cadenza that combines most of the ideas previously heard, and at great length, until, as Ravel wrote, they are brusquely interrupted by a brutal conclusion. You might feel a bit mugged by the ending of this concerto. My favorite part of the G major concerto is the second slow movement, which begins with an unusually quiet and gentle solo. Despite the weather, despite flu season, please try to hold back your coughs after the first movement, because the effect of that second movement is absolutely magical. It reminds me of the Gymnopédie by Erik Satie, which you'll hear next weekend, I believe, although it's musically far more complex than anything Satie ever attempted. The G major concerto falls into the traditional 3 movements with a boisterous conclusion. Ravel composed these concertos back to back, but it's only rarely that we get to hear them back to back, and that is quite a privilege. So tonight's concert takes us from the beginning of Ravel's creative career to its end. The only work he completed after the 2 piano concertos was a set of 3 songs from Don Quixote to Dulcinea. Thereafter, a mental fog seemed to descend, slowly, inexorably. Many creative plans were hatched, but all Ravel could manage was to change the order in which he planned to take them on. He would tell friends he could hear the music in his head, but he just couldn't write it down. Even writing a 1-page letter would take him a week as he struggled to look up each and every word in the Larousse dictionary. No doctor was ever able to diagnose what the problem was. He had increasing trouble remembering names, but retained much of his musical acuity. In the last year of Ravel's life, 1937, Paul Wittgenstein's exclusive right to perform the concerto for the left hand expired. Wittgenstein had taken many liberties with the concerto, and for 6 years, Ravel had only been able to gnash his teeth in frustration. But now, with Wittgenstein's monopoly ended, Ravel plunged into the task of coaching his favorite pianist, Jacques Février, in the proper execution of the work. And he got to hear Février play it, with Charles Munch conducting in March 1937, just before he died. 5 years later, Février recorded the concerto with Munch. You can all hear it on YouTube. as I did a couple days ago, performed almost as well as you will hear it tonight. Thank you so much for your kind attention.